The next day, Baron Danglars saw the Count of Monte Cristo's carriage enter his courtyard. He came out to meet the Count with a sad but affable expression on his face. "You've no doubt come to express your sympathy," he said. "Oh, be careful, Count. The men of our generation are unlucky this year. There's our puritanical public prosecutor, Monsieur de Villefort, who's losing his whole family in a strange manner. Then there's Monsieur de Morcerf, dishonored and dead. And there's myself, covered with ridicule by that devilish Benedetto, and what?" asked the Count. "Haven't you heard? A new misfortune. My daughter Eugenie has left us." "Impossible!" "It's true, Count. She was crushed by the affront we received from that wretched scoundrel and asked me for permission to make a trip. She left night before last." "With Madame Danglars?" "No, with a relative. I'm afraid we've lost her, poor Eugenie. I know her character, and I doubt she'll ever consent to come back to France." "Such sorrows would be unbearable for a man whose daughter was his only fortune," said Monte Cristo, "but they ought to be quite bearable for a millionaire. No matter what the philosophers say, money is always a great consolation, and you, the king of the world of finance, ought to have greater consolation than anyone else." Danglars cast a sidelong glance at Monte Cristo to see if he was joking or speaking seriously. "Yes," he said, "if fortune is a consolation, I ought to be consoled. I'm rich. So rich, Baron, that your fortune is like the pyramids. If one should want to destroy them, one wouldn't dare. If one should dare, one wouldn't be able to." Danglars smiled and said, "That reminds me. I was signing some checks when you came in. Will you allow me to finish?" "Certainly." There was a moment during which the only sound to be heard was the scratching of the banker's pen. Then Danglars said to Monte Cristo, "Have you seen many scraps of paper like this, each one worth 1,000,000 francs?" Monte Cristo took the 5 scraps of paper which Danglars proudly handed to him and said, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,000,000 francs. "That's how I do business," said Danglars. "It's wonderful, especially if the sum will be paid in cash, as I'm sure it will." "It will," said Danglars. "It's a fine thing to have such credit. Only in France could you see something like this. 5 scraps of paper worth 5,000,000 francs. It has to be seen to be believed." "Do you doubt it?" "No." "You don't sound very convinced. Why don't you see for yourself? Go with my clerk to the bank, and you'll see him come out with a draft on the treasury for the same sum." "No," said Monte Cristo, folding the 5 checks. "The thing is so extraordinary that I'll make the experiment myself. My credit with you was 6,000,000 francs. I've drawn 900,000, so you still owe me 5,100,000. I'll take your 5 scraps of paper, which I trust to be valid from the sight of your signature alone, and here's a receipt for 6,000,000 francs, which settles our account. I made it out before I came here because I'm greatly in need of money today." Monte Cristo put the 5 checks into his pocket with one hand while he held out the receipt to Danglars with the other. Danglars was panic-stricken. "What? Are you taking those checks?" he stammered. "Excuse me, but I owe that money to the hospitals. It's a deposit I promised to repay this morning." "Ah, that's different," said Monte Cristo. "I'm not determined to have these 5 checks. You can give me another one. I took these only so that I could say that, without 5 minutes' delay, the Danglars firm had paid me 5,000,000 francs on the spot. It would have been remarkable. But here are your checks. Give me another one." Danglars put out his hand to take the checks, but suddenly he appeared to change his mind and made a violent effort to control himself. Then he smiled and said, "After all, Count, your receipt is as good as cash. Of course, if you were in Rome, the firm of Thomson and French would pay you as easily as you've paid me. Shall I keep these, then?" "Yes, keep them," said Danglars, wiping away the perspiration that had broken out at the roots of his hair. Monte Cristo put the 5 checks into his pocket with an expression that said clearly, "Think it over. There's still time to change your mind." No, keep them," said Danglars. "You know how formalistic a banker is. I was going to give that money to the hospitals, and for a moment it seemed to me I'd be robbing them if I didn't give them those very same checks, as though 1 franc weren't the same as the other. Excuse me, Count." And he burst into loud, nervous laughter. "I excuse you," said Monte Cristo graciously, "and I put your money into my pocket." "But I still owe you 100,000 francs." "Oh, that's only a trifle. The convenience amounts to that much. Keep it, and we'll consider our account settled." "Are you speaking seriously, Count?" "I never joke with bankers," said the Count, with a seriousness that almost amounted to impertinence. As he was walking toward the door, a servant entered and announced, "Monsieur de Beauvais, Commissioner of Hospitals." Danglars paled and hastened to take leave of Monte Cristo, who exchanged a ceremonious bow with Monsieur de Beauvais as he passed through the waiting room. Outside, he climbed into his carriage and drove straight to the bank. Meanwhile, Danglars, restraining his emotion, greeted the commissioner of hospitals. It goes without saying that a courteous smile was stamped on his lips. "How are you today, dear creditor?" he asked. "Am I right in assuming you've come to me as a creditor?" "You assume correctly, Baron," said Monsieur de Bovy. "Did you receive my letter yesterday?" "Yes." "Well, here's my receipt." "Monsieur de Bovy," said Danglars, "I'll have to ask you to wait until tomorrow in view of the fact that the Count of Monte Cristo, whom you saw in the waiting room, walked out of here with your 5,000,000 francs." "What?" "The Count had an unlimited credit with me, a credit opened by the firm of Thompson and French of Rome. He came to me today to ask for 5,000,000 francs all at once, so I gave him a check. As you can understand, I'm afraid the bank may find it a little strange if I withdrew 10,000,000 francs in one day." "Do you mean to say," exclaimed Monsieur de Bovy in a tone of complete incredulity, "that you gave 5,000,000 francs to that man who just left here and who bowed to me as though he knew me? Here's his receipt. See for yourself." Monsieur de Bovy took the receipt and read it with an expression of great admiration. "I must visit this man," he said, "and ask him for a donation to charity. I'll cite him the example of Madame de Morcerf and her son. What about them? They gave their entire fortune to the hospitals." "What fortune?" "The fortune of the late General de Morcerf." "But why did they do that?" "They say they want nothing to do with the money acquired in such an ignoble way." "How will they live then?" "The mother is going to live in the provinces, and the son has enlisted in the army. But let's come back to our 5,000,000 francs." "Gladly," said Danglars, in a perfectly natural tone. "Are you in a hurry to have the money?" "Of course. Our books are being examined tomorrow." "Tomorrow? Why, that's more than enough time. What time is the examination?" "At 2 o'clock. Send someone here at noon." Monsieur de Bovy nodded reluctantly and fingered his portfolio. "Just a moment," said Danglars. "I have a better idea. The Count of Monte Cristo's receipt is the same as money. Take it to Rothschild or Lafitte, and they'll accept it on sight." "Even though it's payable in Rome?" "Certainly. Of course, it will cost you a discount of 5,000 or 6,000 francs." "Then I'd rather wait till tomorrow." "What strange ideas you have!" "Very well, then, I'll pay you tomorrow." "And I'll have the money without fail." "Of course. Why, you must be joking. Send someone here tomorrow, and the bank will be notified." "I'll come in person." "So much the better. That will give me the pleasure of seeing you again." They shook hands. "By the way," said Monsieur de Bovy, "aren't you going to that poor Mademoiselle de Villefort's funeral? I passed the procession on the way here." "No, I still feel a little ridiculous after that Benedetto affair, and I want to stay out of sight as much as possible for a while." "You may be sure everyone sympathizes with you, and especially with your daughter." "Poor Eugenie," said Danglars with a deep sigh. "Have you heard that she's going to enter a convent?" "No. Alas, it's only too true. The day after the disaster, she decided to leave with a friend of hers who's already a nun. She's going to find some very severe convent in Italy or Spain." "Oh, that's terrible." Monsieur de Bovy withdrew, expressing his deepest sympathy as he left. But as soon as he was gone, Danglars exclaimed vehemently, "Idiot! I'll be far away from here when you come tomorrow." Then he locked the door, collected 50,000 francs or so in the cash from a drawer, burned certain papers, and placed others in evidence, and wrote a letter, whose only address was to Madame Danglars. He took out his passport from a drawer, looked at it, and said, "Good. It's valid for 2 more months."